So here's a question. How does an ethically monstrous totalitarian regime make its oppression feel, well, completely ordinary?
Right.
And how do citizens adapt or even become complicit when freedom isn't just stolen in one single act, but is eroded piece by agonizing piece?
That process, that normalization, the idea that you just stop noticing the walls closing in, that is the absolute core of what Margaret Atwood explores. She isn't asking how a society collapses, she's asking how a society accepts it.
Exactly. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into Margaret Atwood's essential book, The Handmaid's Tale. Our goal is to go beyond a simple plot summary, though of course we'll cover the basics, to really examine the author's methods.
How she builds her argument, shapes this warning, and ultimately challenges our own complacency.
Yes, our complacency as readers.
So this deep dive is really focused on the book's rhetorical power. We're going to analyze the constrained voice of Offred and show how Atwood uses her to expose both the insidious seductions of Gilead's supposed order and the visceral everyday horrors of it.
We want to give you the tools to read with a sharper insight, not just tell you the story. So, enjoy a bold new take on book coverage with this extended analysis.
It's more than just a summary.
Much more. This feature really examines how the author shapes an argument, builds influence, and earns or maybe loses your trust. It gives you skills for greater discernment. Should you read this book? Well, this should absolutely help.
It's also, I think, excellent for aspiring writers.
Definitely. And if you find this expanded format valuable, we would love to hear from you. Your feedback really does help guide our future content.
And as we get into it, we should mention that you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation. It's powered by Google's Notebook LM, and it's designed for a deeper, more dynamic analysis.
Okay, so let's start with the absolute bedrock of this novel's power, its overwhelming plausibility.
Yes.
Atwood, she's a Canadian writer known for her engagement with feminist, political, environmental issues. And she explicitly refuses to write science fiction. She calls her work speculative fiction. What's the difference there? Why does that matter so much?
It's absolutely crucial. Science fiction often invents things, technologies or worlds that don't exist, warp drives, aliens, that sort of thing.
Right.
Speculative fiction, at least how Atwood uses it, extrapolates directly from real historical and contemporary abuses. She famously said that nothing in the book is truly invented.
So every mechanism of control.
Every single one.
Yeah.
From the public executions on the wall to restricting women's access to money or literacy, it all has a precedent somewhere in human history.
So Gilead isn't built on some impossible future tech. It's built from recognizable pieces: Puritanism, forced re-education, fundamentalist movements, the reproductive politics that were already being intensely debated in the mid-1980s when the book came out.
Precisely. The timing is so critical. The book emerged amid this intense anxiety about a backlash to second-wave feminism. You had the rise of the moral majority in the U.S., huge debates on reproductive rights, and at the same time,
These very real anxieties about the environment.
yes, environmental degradation leading to sharply declining birth rates, widespread infertility.
She's stitching together three very real, very current fears: the political, the biological, and the theological, and just showing how they could all coalesce into one nightmare.
And by tying the collapse of society to these real anxieties, not some invented catastrophe, Atwood achieves this incredibly powerful rhetorical effect. She's blending a dystopian novel, feminist satire, and a sort of pseudo-historical record.
And that blend, it just ratchets up the urgency and this terrifying plausibility.
It implies directly, this didn't come out of nowhere and it could happen here.
It's terrifying because the implied audience, you reading today or someone reading back in the 80s, you recognize these trends. You're invited to see how these small, seemingly minor legal and cultural shifts,
Like restricting access to credit for women.
right, or redefining certain jobs,
Okay.
could plausibly add up to something as monstrous as Gilead. It's the slow creep, the accumulation, not a single disaster. That's the real warning.
And the structure of the book itself reinforces that feeling. It's constantly alternating between Offred's present life and her fragmented memories of before.
That nonlinear pattern.
It mimics how trauma works on the mind. It shows us that the very act of telling the story becomes an act of survival, of trying to piece your own past back together.
That structural choice anchoring this whole political critique in one deeply fractured consciousness, that brings us right to Offred's constrained voice, which is arguably the book's most potent weapon.
It's fascinating, her narrative voice. It's a first-person memoir, but it's often fragmented, constantly drifting into memory, fantasy, speculation.
Which creates this profound intimacy. We're right there in her head, feeling her fears.
But at the same time, it creates profound unreliability, and that unreliability, counterintuitively, actually makes the political critique stronger.
Wait, isn't that a huge risk? Relying on an unreliable narrator? Doesn't that risk undermining the critique if you can't entirely trust the storyteller?
Not if the unreliability is a direct result of the oppression she's suffering. Offred's shifting narrative shows her as a split self. There's June, the woman she was, and then Offred, the role she's forced into.
So this duality shows a woman who is both shaped by the regime.
And quietly resisting it. Using language in her own head to carve out a little mental space where the regime has completely colonized her body.
And she constantly revises her own story. She'll describe something, then immediately pull back and say, it didn't happen that way, or maybe I'm just projecting.
Right. It foregrounds the fact that she's a storyteller under extreme duress. Her digressions, her gaps, those aren't narrative mistakes. They're symptoms of her trauma. It forces the reader to participate in reconstructing Gilead's reality right alongside her.
The difficulty of testifying becomes part of the testimony.
Exactly.
Right.
Now let's try applying a classical rhetorical framework to this. Ethos, pathos, and logos. How does Atwood build her case? Let's start with ethos or credibility. We just said she's unreliable, so how is she credible?
Well, that's the genius of it. Offred's ethos is explicitly fallible. She is not a hero. Her narrative is modest. It's self-questioning. She admits her fear, her small acts of complicity, even forbidden desires, like her relationship with Nick.
Which really complicates her loyalty to the resistance.
It does. And by refusing that heroic posture, Atwood makes Offred's critique so much more unsettling. Because she's just trying to survive, she invites you, the reader, to see your own potential for passivity or even collaboration.
You're forced to confront the thought, I might not be a hero either. I might just be trying to get through the week.
It's the relatability of her moral compromises that hooks you.
Yeah.
Okay, so then there's pathos, the emotional appeal. Where does the book really hit us hardest emotionally?
The pathos. It operates so powerfully through this profound sense of domestic loss. The most wrenching moments are often her memories of her child, her mother, the small, mundane rituals from before Gilead.
She doesn't just focus on the big, spectacular punishments on the wall.
No, she focuses on the loss of everyday autonomy.
I remember reading this for the first time, and the part that always stuck with me wasn't the executions. It was the moment Offred realizes she can't choose her own toothpaste. That loss of just mundane control. That's a deeper psychological invasion.
It connects directly to the reader's own life. It makes the horror tangible. Then finally, there's logos, the appeal to logic. How does Atwood show that Gilead, this horrifying place, actually functions with its own internal logic?
It works because it presents a logical solution to a perceived crisis.
Yeah.
Even if the solution is monstrous.
Precisely. Gilead is shown to be internally logical. It coherently ties together the theological justification using repurposed scripture
A biological necessity with the infertility crisis.
and the security and necessity of a total police state. These elements all reinforce each other. The argument is, God punished us with low birth rates, therefore we must implement a system based on religious law to save humanity. And that system requires absolute security.
It's a completely self-sustaining argument.
And Atwood uses this to show how arguments can be perfectly coherent, structurally sound, and still be ethically monstrous. Logic and morality are severed.
And that systematic structure of tyranny relies almost entirely on the control of language. While you are considering the power of language and resistance, take a moment to check out Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques. It's all about inspiring reflection and rational thought.
Now, diving back into language control, scholars really emphasize that this regime controls people by controlling discourse. The state doesn't just outlaw books, it completely hijacks language itself.
You see it in the repurposed biblical phrases like the greeting, praise be. But what's more insidious is the systemic renaming. Women are stripped of their own names and renamed by their male possessors, Offred, Offglen.
Which literally translates to of Fred, of Glenn.
Yes.
This systematic renaming and censorship is the purest illustration of how discourse can erase identity. The book shows how language isn't just a tool for communication, it is the primary mechanism of state power. The woman June is still there, but she's like a palimpsest. An earlier text that's been written over by the regime's new word, Offred.
And in contrast to that huge macro-level control, you get the micro-resistance.
Offred's quiet little acts.
Her private wordplay, her attention to puns, to etymology, her internal jokes. Even when the commander tries to use her for a game of Scrabble, she's reclaiming a little mental space through language, even when her body is totally owned by the state.
And the visual language is just as controlling. Atwood uses this incredible symbolic shorthand to compress complex power relations, making the system instantly legible.
The vivid, reductive symbols, the red garments of the handmaids, the blue for the wives, green for the Marthas. This color coding immediately classifies and contains women. It eliminates all complexity.
And then you have the omnipresent eyes, the surveillance, and the physical symbol of repression, the wall where the bodies hang.
This constant visual shorthand makes the state's ownership of fertile bodies visible to everyone all the time. It reminds them of the power structure without needing a single word. It's chillingly efficient propaganda.
So let's synthesize all of these choices, the structural, the rhetorical, to really understand Atwood's core purpose. Because as we've said, it's so much more than a simple condemnation of extreme patriarchy.
Absolutely. Her central warning is about showing how stepwise changes, economic disenfranchisement, legal reclassification, ideological campaigns, can shift an entire social order from unthinkable to normal.
Making oppression feel ordinary to the people living it.
And crucially, the book really complicates that simple victim versus oppressor binary. It forces us to look beyond good versus evil and actually examine complicity.
Right. Atwood spotlights the varied positions of women. You have handmaids, wives, Marthas, econowives, and then the aunts, who are the fiercest enforcers of the patriarchy. It raises these really difficult questions about who benefits, or at least survives, under totalitarianism.
The ants are not victims. They're ideologues who believe in the system's necessity, and they wield brutal power.
And the wives, like Serena Joy, are theoretically at the top of the female hierarchy, but they are also profoundly miserable, victimized by the very system they helped build, and are complicit in upholding.
And they often turn their anger and suppression onto the handmaids.
The system is designed to turn the oppressed against each other. It divides potential resistance along lines of class and status. Atwood doesn't give you the comfort of a simple, united female resistance. Survival itself requires these murky, ethical compromises.
So when we look at the overall rhetorical effectiveness, what stands out as her single most powerful choice?
I think it has to be anchoring that huge political and sociological critique in a single, intensely constrained but deeply human consciousness.
It's that combination.
It is. The intimate first-person narration combined with this satiric but terrifyingly plausible world building. It transforms the political warning into a moral thought experiment for you, the reader.
We're forced to ask ourselves, how would I compromise? How would I survive or resist? It's not a story about them. It's a terrifying projection of us.
And then there's that deeply uneasy final chapter, the historical notes.
Yes, we jump centuries forward to this academic conference where scholars are coolly debating Offred's taped narrative as just an artifact, an incomplete historical document.
This reframing is Atwood's final, almost cynical critique. It shows how our institutions can sanitize and distance us from lived suffering. The scholars are debating the validity of her story. They're joking about the commander.
They're more worried about the historical provenance of the tapes than the actual pain they describe.
She leaves the reader deeply uneasy about how easily future audiences, or even us now, might just analyze or aestheticize injustices instead of actually preventing them. Offred's voice, which we just experienced as this raw, emotional testimony, becomes just another object of study, labeled and filed away.
So we've covered the power of this intimate, unreliable narrator in driving political critique, the focus on the process of normalization based on real history, and the structural logic that makes a monstrous regime feel coherent.
The book's enduring effectiveness, I think, lies in its refusal to give us a simple hero or a clean ending. It forces you to wrestle with the idea of survival versus resistance in a world where oppression is mundane.
Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought, raised by that closing scene. If your deepest suffering became merely an academic artifact centuries from now, who would you trust to interpret your history?
A profound question about legacy and truth that resonates long, long after you finish the book.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book summary, subscribe, share, consider purchasing the book via the link, and think rationally.